And for tonight, we're going to be taking a look at Latinx and Hispanic soldiers during the Civil War. We have with us Jen Edginton, who is the Curator of Social Studies Education at the Kenosha Museum campus, which includes the Kenosha Public Museum, the Dinosaur Discovery Museum, and the Civil War Museum. And she has been there for the past 4 years. Jen has a bachelor's degree in anthropology and a certificate in museum studies from Michigan State University, and a master's of science in education from the University of Kansas. And she has been working in the museum field for 15 years at various institutions, including the Field Museum, the Napier Settlement, the Museum of Science and Industry, and her current work focuses on making social sciences inclusive and accessible to all learners. So I'm going to turn the screen over to Jen and let her tell you about Latinx soldiers.
Okay. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. Thumbs up, perfect. You can tell I teach usually 8th graders, so thumbs up. My name is Jen Edginton. I'll talk about that in just a minute. I am here to talk a little bit about Hispanic and Latinx soldiers in the Civil War. But first, I would like to just take a moment and do a land acknowledgement, because we are going to be focusing on some Indigenous soldiers. I thought this was very good practice. So for myself, I'm in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and it is with gratitude and humility that I acknowledge that I am speaking on the ancestral lands of the Potawatomi, Miami, Kickapoo, and Sauk, who are the Indigenous peoples of these lands. I pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we continue or commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. So now I'll kind of go into it. I wanted to make sure I got my land acknowledgement out of the way. My name is Jen Edginton. I am the Curator of Education at the Kenosha Museum campus. After the presentation, if you have further follow-up, I'm happy to answer. I do have an email address and you'll see it at the end. Our website is thecivilwarmuseum.org. And I always like to tell people that although I'm not a Civil War historian by training, this has been my passion since I was a small child. And so working in a Civil War museum has been really exciting and just something that I adore. So a little bit about my museum. Some of you may have heard of Kenosha recently on the news with the unrest. So Kenosha is actually located halfway between Chicago and Milwaukee, right on Lake Michigan. So it's a pretty small lake community. We have around 100,000 people. We're the 4th largest city in Wisconsin. We opened our Civil War Museum in 2008. So it's again part of that museum campus of the Dinosaur Discovery Museum, the Kenosha Public Museum, and the Civil War Museum, which was the last one added. Our museum's pretty unique. So we only focus on the 7 states that make up the upper Midwest in their role in the Civil War. So when I'm talking today, you will notice I don't really talk about the Confederacy. That's because my work focuses just on the Union, and in particular, the Midwest. I've kind of expanded it because there weren't a lot of Hispanic people living in the Midwest during the 1860s. So, but you'll still see it's very kind of focused for me. And then the reason that I'm doing it's kind of twofold. Today is the kickoff of Hispanic Heritage Month. It goes from September 15th to October 15th. And then also for our museum, we are currently opening an immigrant exhibit that we have been doing in-house. So all of the research that you see today is stuff that will be presented, and we're opening that in around December 2020. So coming up in a few months. So really quick, I do get a lot of questions on what's Hispanic, what's Latinx, and what's the difference between them. So Hispanic refers to the language. Those are Spanish-speaking countries. So when we think of Hispanics, oftentimes Brazil does not count in that because they do not speak Spanish, they speak Portuguese, but it's people living in those areas or descendants from those areas. And then oftentimes you'll hear Latino, Latina, and that's referring more towards cultural or geographical regions, which is Latin American focused. Latinx is the more inclusive term. However, in Spanish-speaking cultures, they also use Latine because X is not really used in Spanish too much. As for myself, I call myself a Latina. I was talking to my family members today. They use the term Hispanic, so it is a personal choice if you are from, our family is from Mexico. So that's where I choose Latina. And this is just a map to kind of get you in the right mind frame of where those Hispanic countries are. So I did include Spain in this talk because that is a Hispanic country. And starting Hispanic Heritage Month, I wanted to make sure to be inclusive to all Hispanic countries. All right, so really quick to set us up, now that I've kind of introduced some of the topics, I focus more on social history. So you'll see me moving forward talk about stories of people and not so much the military aspect. If you have questions on that, I will try my best, but really what I like to focus on is telling stories and really focusing on the people that were around during the Civil War. But to understand the people that were around, we need to understand why they were here. So I'm going to look first at Mexico and how really those that were living in Mexico ended up in the United States prior to the Civil War and during the Civil War that allowed them to fight in the Civil War. So as you can imagine, Spanish rule has been in the United States for a very long time. One of the earliest settlements was actually in Florida. It was a colony dating back to the 1500s. So Spain has been in control of certain parts of Latin America and North America for a very long time. When we're looking at before the Civil War though, we have to remember that Spain still had some elements within the United States, including Florida. So Mexico itself during this time was still under Spanish rule. We have elements of Florida in the southeast that start annexing into the United States. Then we also have parts of Texas, right? We know that, annexing into the United States. And all of that really stems from that manifest destiny that came from a lot of our founding fathers that wanted to continue that push for more land because the United States was the one that was supposed to have that land, right? We all know manifest destiny. And that actually ends up leading towards the Mexican-American War. We could do a whole history happy hour on the Mexican-American War. It's a lot to cover, so I'm not even gonna try. We know that Mexico was not too happy when the United States tried to annex Texas, and it created some not so great issues. And it ended up in the war. And the war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And if you notice on the map, this was the Mexican territory before the war. So Mexico actually shrinks almost by 50%. And now all of those people that were living in Mexico are now living in the United States. And they're not citizens, but they're living in the United States. Mexico is not the only country that has soldiers coming that we can refer to as Latinx or Hispanic. So we need to remember that, again, Spain has had a very large presence in the Americas for hundreds of years. The first settlement was 1565 in St. Augustine in Florida. So we know they were here. So when we talk about the Spanish soldiers, they're not new to America. And then the US, during the Mexican-American War, they become very active and interested in the Caribbean and in Central America. And again, they try and make some of those land grabs in the name of manifest destiny. So they did something called filibustering, which is not the filibustering we know today in legislation, but it actually was they would have an armed citizen go into a country and try and take that for the United States. It wasn't very successful. We'll just put it that way. So we know that there has always been kind of this give and take in the Caribbean and in some of those Central American countries with the United States, even starting at this time. However, the United States does not leave a great impression on these island nations and the Central American nations after trying to take their land. As you can imagine, that wouldn't be great politically. And as for South America, which again, Hispanic soldiers did come from, by the time of the Civil War, there is a give and take between wealthy businessmen that are moving towards South America for labor as well as supplies. So we already have a trade route kind of set up happening. So why did the Hispanic soldiers fight? Why did Latinx soldiers fight? They fought for a lot of the reasons that other soldiers would have fought. They had positions on slavery. They were hoping to become United States citizens, especially those that maybe were in annexed land or land that just got turned over to the United States and they weren't considered citizens yet. I always joke with my 8th graders, why wouldn't you want to? You gotta get out of Wisconsin and start an adventure. But adventure was another reason, as well as a paycheck. The one thing though about Hispanic soldiers is they could be subject to draft. So especially in the Confederacy. And what's really interesting in my research is oftentimes in the Civil War, there are only 3 categories of race. So it was white, it was black, and it was mulatto. There wasn't anything else. So I do a lot of work with Asian soldiers and Hispanic and Latinx soldiers, and they don't fit those molds. And so we actually have several records of Asian soldiers coming forward and saying that they were taken capture and they were taken prisoner, and the guard did not know how to categorize them. And it would actually say, what are you? So we do see a lot of Spanish descendants that are fighting more than necessarily those from Latin America that might have had the darker skin. So again, they would have been subject to the draft. There isn't a ton of research or work that has been done on Hispanic soldiers, but we do know that most of them were called Tejanos, which were Mexican born Texans who fought for the Confederacy. Again, as someone that doesn't cover the Confederacy, the pickings were a little bit smaller on who I wanted to cover for this talk. So now that I got I laid that foundation, and I hope that you understand why soldiers were here, why they're fighting, I want to talk about some individual soldiers themselves. So I'm going to go into my first story, which is Edward Ferrero. And I'm not sure if anybody has heard his story before. He does spark a little bit of controversy later in his life. And I kind of slipped him in. I don't know if everyone would agree that he's a Hispanic soldier. He's born in Granada, Spain to Italian parents. So that's kind of maybe he wasn't Hispanic, but for this, I'm going to say he was. And he moved to America at a very young age. However, he was exposed to a lot of military elements throughout his childhood, because Garibaldi was a big influence, and I believe his uncle fought. So he was around a lot of military, and it really piqued his interest. However, his parents, his dad was a dance instructor, so he followed the lead of his dad. He became a very well-known New York City dance instructor who was very sought after. He wrote books about dancing. He was responsible for every dance craze that was popular before the Civil War. So if you can imagine, this gentleman, who we now know as a soldier, huge in the dance community. And he actually starts teaching dance at West Point, but he mainly focuses in New York City. The war breaks out, and he decides he really wants to, you know, continue that family legacy of fighting in the Civil War, or while in fighting, and so he enlists in the Civil War. He actually raises his own regiment at his own expense, the 51st New York, which is the Shepherd Rifles. So he ends up, does a lot of really great work. He fights at first, he served at South Mountain, and then he fights at Antietam, and at Antietam he gets a little bit more recognition because he's one of the people that storms Burnside's Bridge. So he is seen, after that, he's actually recommended for his bravery, and he gets promoted to Brigadier General. And then from there, he does get attached as a USTC officer, which is going to play the part of his downfall too, which is the Curator. So we have really high, he did a really great job in Antietam, and he did not so great at the Curator. There's a lot of different things that go into the Curator in general, and again, whole nother story to get into, but basically, for maybe like the two people like my parents watching, the Curator was a really kind of misfortune of the US Army, and they tried to surprise attack the Confederacy by blowing up underneath their camp. It created a large crater, and the whole point was then to attack and not miss the momentum. Unfortunately, there was a lot of confusion, and very unfortunately, a lot of people, including USTC soldiers and natives, died during this. So Ferrero is one of the ones that is seen as the problem during the Curator. He is reprimanded after, and he's actually told that, or in the court, they said that he was hiding. He was not out on the battlefield, and he possibly was sharing rum with the other general who caused all this chaos. After he died, there's actually a newspaper article I found that says General Ferrero dead. A scandal of the date of the Civil War is recalled. So the Battle of the Crater really tarnishes Ferrero's legacy, because he's no longer remembered as this hero that stormed Burnside's Bridge and really fought hard at Antietam. He's now seen as this leader that a lot of his men get hurt or confused or put down their weapon. It just turns into chaos. So we have Ferrero. I wanted to kind of bring us back to the other side of the Hispanic nations, and I want to talk about Adrian J Vidal. There are no pictures of him. However, I did find a painting. I don't know if this is what he looked like, so I'm just going with the man with the question mark because don't really know what he looked like. So Adrian J Vidal was, again, a Mexican Texan. He was born, and he was described as having dark complexion, hazel eyes, and black hair. He grew up working with steamboats and going up and down the Rio Grande. And when he's young, his mom remarries a very wealthy stepfather. And that wealth is going to play in his favor later on. Vidal does not work very hard after his mother remarries. And he's 17 years old when the Civil War breaks out, and it's really big around the Rio Grande. So he first enrolls as a private in Captain James Duff's company of partisan rangers at San Antonio in October of 1862. And he's in Company A. Great, doing good. So his fellow soldiers, they describe him as vain, without any experience, who cares for nothing except gambling and drinking. So as you can imagine, he's not well liked by his fellow soldiers. He's kind of seen as spoiled because of, again, his stepfather. And his stepfather likes to use his wealth and his position to continue his steps up. So he shortly becomes lieutenant, even though he doesn't earn it. It's because of his stepfather. And so he moves up to captain then and is placed in command of a company of militia at Boca del Rio to guard the entrance of the Rio Grande. He does okay, and he's recognized for his bravery by the Confederate authorities because he captures a federal gunboat and the whole crew. Great. Doing okay so far. He does not last as doing so good. So there are a few versions depending on who you believe here. And one is that Vidal is unable to attain enough supplies for his men, and so the whole crew or the whole company mutinies. The second version is he's mad because the Confederacy is supporting the French invaders of Mexico, and so he rallies up his men and they're gonna attack the Confederacy. So it's one of two potentials. And either way, he kind of cuts off ties from the other Confederate units around him. And so one, General B, sends two privates to go check on him, make sure everything's going okay. He shoots them both, kills one. The other one is sent back severely wounded. General B hears they're mutinying, they're leaving the Confederacy, so he goes to actually start moving towards Vidal and his men. Vidal then goes on a pro-Confederate farm raid, and he loots everything, kills Confederate sympathizers, and then joins the Union Army when he finds them and says, I'm done with the Confederacy, I'm ready for the Union. So he then is in charge of another Rangers for the Union this time. As you can imagine from someone like Mr. Vidal, he doesn't do well with authority, he doesn't do well with directions, and he doesn't do well with hard work. So he gets really mad and bored and tired of fighting and listening to people. So he decides to leave the Union Army. And this time, the Union Army says, you can't do that. We just don't let people go. And especially with he wanted to have an honorable discharge. That doesn't happen. And so him and a lot of his men that he brought to the Union actually run away to Mexico in the middle of the night. And then in Mexico, he decides, I'm going to start the fight too. So he's fighting in Mexico, and he actually gets caught. His stepdad gets basically asked for money, ransomed out, and his stepdad doesn't pay and he dies. So that's the story of Mr. Vidal. And now I'm going to bounce back to the Curator. I needed to step away, and now we're going to talk about the Curator again. This side from the successful side, though. So Henry Pleasants was born on February 16th, 1833 in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He was born to an American father and a Spanish mother. So again, his mom is also Hispanic in this case. Some like the Italian, or with Ferrero, we know that his parents were Italian. In this case, he is Hispanic. He was born in a Hispanic country too. At 13 years old, he moves to the United States and he's sent to a school in Philadelphia. During his youth, he ends up working on the railroad and in the coal mines. And in 1857, he moves to Pottsville, Pennsylvania, where he's going to become a civil engineer working in the coal mines. He gets married, but unfortunately his wife dies very quickly after their new marriage. So not so great. And kind of because he doesn't really have a lot keeping him home, he decides to enlist in the Civil War once it breaks out. So he enlists for 3 months in the 6th Pennsylvania as a second lieutenant. He really is covering the railroad in this time. And then he re-enlists, this time as a captain at the 48th Pennsylvania, where he soon gets promoted to lieutenant colonel and commander of the 48th. So with the 48th, he's seeing some battles. He is fighting in battles including Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and Petersburg. Pleasance was really innovative, and he was kind of this creative thinker that as an educator I would have adored. He had ways to kind of think of solutions that maybe he that his other cohorts or other soldiers would not have thought of. So he is really getting frustrated with the many failed attempts to take Petersburg and the fails to do that for the Union. So he brings up the idea of digging a trench under the Confederate line and blowing it up. Most of his men in the 48th are coal miners by trade. This is not going to be a problem for them. So a lot of his men are kind of creating this idea together. He then presents the idea, and it is given the green light. It's given the go-ahead. So Pleasance and his men start digging on June 25th, 1864. By July 17th, he's completed 510-foot length shaft. So it's a pretty long shaft under there. And then he hid what he was doing by, he'd start digging and he would then hide his ventilation in depressions in the earth. So if someone looked over it, they couldn't see kind of the holes coming up because they would be hid under little hills. So again, he's continually digging this. He's coming up with the idea of where he's going to put the explosives, where it's going to blow up. And Pleasance is really getting this. He's got that engineer mind. Initially, the mine attack is kind of dismissed, ignored. They don't think it's a good idea, but in July, Ulysses S. Grant gives permission to do this. And the attack is supposed to be twofold, like I talked about before, right? The explosion and then the attack. Attack doesn't follow through, but the explosion does work. And so when we always think about the crater being such kind of a disaster, I don't think we give Pleasance enough, because he actually really did pull off a pretty incredible feat to dig unnoticed and be able to cause this kind of chaotic scene when the explosion happened. However, the aftermath that Ferrero and Ledley were doing, not so great. So I did want to kind of share his story. He returns to Philadelphia after the war, or Pennsylvania after the war, and he does become a chief engineer. And then further on, he becomes a superintendent of the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company. And then he passes away at 47. So he doesn't live a very long life, but he continues to kind of stay true to who he was, with always that railroad work and the coal mining work too. All right. So I think I'm on my last stories here. So I wanted to talk about the Fernandez Cavada brothers, and some people may know one of them or maybe none of them. They're pretty well known for various different things. So there's actually 3, but only 2 are in the story because 2 served in the Civil War. So we have Federico Fernandez Cavada, who was born July 8th in 1831, and his brother Adolfo, which he went by Adolf, so I'll probably call him that. Fernandez Cavada, who was born May 17th, 1832. They're born close together. These 2 were very close too. They are born in Cienfuegos, Cuba. They had an American mother and a Spanish father, so their father was not Cuban. He was from Spain. And they did have an older brother, like I said, so he was Emilio Fernandez Cavada, because Fernandez Cavada is the whole last name. And then their dad dies when they're relatively young. And so the mother, who is American and from Philadelphia, named Emily, decides to bring them home to Philadelphia in 1838. She remarries shortly after, again, to a wealthy stepfather. But they moved away, but they've never felt like they lost their ties to Cuba, or they really feel connected to their homeland, even though they did not live there for very long. So I want to talk about the less well-known one first. So the younger brother, it's kind of funny that I'm skipping. So Adolf Fernandez Cavada, he, again, is the younger brother. He served in the Union Army in the 23rd Pennsylvania. He enlists with his brother. They're both in the 23rd, and then his brother transfers out to kind of go on to bigger and better things. And Adolf is actually becomes an aide to General A. Humphreys, or Andrews A. Humphreys. He fights in some of the bigger battles in Petersburg, and he's also at Gettysburg, as is his brother. And during Gettysburg, he keeps a very detailed diary of his time there, to the point where a lot of some of the historic facts and descriptions, some of them are not so, peachy, are from him. And if you read his journals, they're very in-depth. They explain a lot about what happened during the war. They're very descriptive. He gets hurt in Gettysburg. It's not too bad. His horse is actually shot out from underneath him, so he does get a little bit hurt, but he continues on during the Civil War. In his journals, though, at Gettysburg, oftentimes he's trying to find his brother. So he's keeping an eye out for his brother's regiment. And his brother's regiment had a very distinct uniform. So again, he is writing about trying to find and locate his brother. I grabbed one excerpt from the Gettysburg Journal. So again, he journaled the whole war, but the Gettysburg one is the one that sticks out. So on the slide, it says, "On every side lay the cold, stiffened bodies of our dead soldiers, sometimes 2 or 3 forming ghastly groups together in the most unnatural attitudes." And that's like one of the more tame versions, but he really takes it upon himself to go above and beyond to really talk about what happened, and you almost feel like you're there if you're reading it. So post-war, he becomes a U.S. consul in Cuba right after the war. And then he's there for a little bit, and then he decides to resign and join the Cuban insurrection, which is later called Cuba's 10 Years War. Him and his brother actually fight in that, so I'll tell you about his brother in a minute. And he is killed in action in December 1871 during a battle. All 3 Fernandez Cavada brothers fight in the Cuban insurrection. And during this time, they actually send letters back and forth to each other, and they are in code sometimes as well. So I talked about the younger one. I'm going to talk about the older one. He went by Fred. So Fred studied engineering. He was a talented artist, kind of like how his brother had a way with words. He had a way with art. He does have 2 pieces in the National Museum of Art in Cuba. They are stunning. You can look online. I pulled them up the other day. They're absolutely beautiful, and they're landscape paintings of what Cuba looked like. So again, he enlists with his brother in the 23rd, and shortly after, he actually joins as a map maker and a drawer and engineer of the balloon unit and the Potomac. So that's what he's going to go do. And you can see some of his sketches that he takes from balloons. He's looking at the Confederacy, and he's sketching what their camps look like, what their formations look like, to give to those underneath. So he's working as one of those observers that can sketch as well as give those messages. After the balloon units dissolved, he does join the 114th Pennsylvania. So and I forgot to mention, but he's kind of the more well-known brother. If you've heard of the Cavada brothers before, you've probably heard of him and seen his picture. And so he is made lieutenant colonel in August of 1862. So going into Gettysburg, which is the big battle that he's known for, he's already a lieutenant colonel. He is captured in Gettysburg. So he's captured on July 2nd, 1863. And he actually he's sent to Libby prison. And he spends from July to March in Libby prison. And it's so much for him that he spends his time documenting his time in Libby prison. So he sketches, this here is actually a sketch from him, from his book, and he documents what happened. I have just one little excerpt from his book, which says, "It was a beautiful country through which we passed." So this is when he's walking to Libby prison. "It is a beautiful country through which we had passed, but it had presented no charms to weary eyes that were compelled to view it through the line of hostile bayonets. We felt but little sympathy for the beautiful. Our haggard countenances, only this was written: give us rest and give us food." So again, he has a way of words too, right? You get it. His march was awful, and he had bayonets pointed at him, and it was pretty, but he couldn't look at it or enjoy it. And his book, or his documentation and his imagery is actually made into a book called Libby Life, and you can still buy the book if you want to see it. It's actually available on Google Books as well. So that, I recommend it. It has absolutely beautiful imagery of what happened in the prison that we know. So again, he gets out the following March after Gettysburg, and he then, after the war, becomes the U.S. consul to Trinidad to Cuba. So one of those paintings I was talking about is actually of Trinidad de Cuba. He resigns his position as U.S. consul in February of 1869 to join the Cuban insurrection. So he actually does before his brother. Again, this is Cuba's 10-year war, and he becomes the commander of all Cuban forces that are fighting. As you can imagine, he becomes a wanted man at that point because they're fighting, and so he ends up getting caught. He's caught and captured, and then he's executed in July of 1871. So to me, I noticed that it was kind of July, it's almost 9 years after he was captured in Gettysburg, and has to go live at Libby. I gave a lot of information to you, and I talk fast. I know that's part of being a Midwesterner. So I really quick wanted to just thank you. If you have any follow-up questions that you don't get asked today, or you just want to drop me a line and talk about my museum, my email is right here. It's jedginton@kenosha.org, and I'm really happy to be here today. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Jen. That was a very informative talk, and you've already got quite a few questions. So I'll start with the first one about Vidal.
Okay.
When he went to Mexico, did he join Juarez's army? He's definitely a person showing the intertwined causes across North America.
That is a good question. I don't know for sure where he ends up in Mexico. His line kind of the information on him kind of dries up very quickly after he leaves the Union Army. I do know that he is killed fighting, but I'm not sure about that. I apologize.
All right, and next question. Given the long-standing tensions between Mexicans and Anglo settlers in the southwestern states, how would you say Mexican Confederates were generally treated in the Confederate Army? And I know you don't specialize in the Confederate Army, but
I only you cut out. So I heard, how would
I'll repeat for you.
Okay,
sorry, it cut out. Given the long-standing tensions between Mexicans and Anglo settlers in the southwestern states, how would you say Mexican Confederates were generally treated in the Confederate Army?
That's a good question. That is a very good question. A lot of them, remember, are in regiments or companies that are made up of other Mexicans from Texas. So they're surrounded by people that are like them, that look like them. Some people did not agree with the draft. Some people did not, want to fight at all. And again, they got drafted. Some people rebelled. There were some unionist views from the Mexicans that were living in Texas. So it was a very dynamic situation. Overall, how were they accepted? It's a great question, because and I was actually talking to my boss about this today, because I again, am not a Confederate scholar by any means. And I said that surprised me that they were drafted. And we again started talking a little bit more about the nuances and complex racial history of surrounding the Civil War. So as much as I would like to say they fit in or they didn't fit in, I know primarily they fought in regiments of people that were like them, as well as it was not everybody wanted to fight, and some people fought back against fighting.
All right, and then another question, a question about how the two sides felt about Hispanic Latinx in the Army, since many fought in Mexico together. Have you found any information on prejudices? And that's very similar, but I think maybe looking at the U.S. side as well as the Confederate side.
Sure. I mean, yes, there's always prejudices against people that are not like the kind of status quo. I imagine that it would have been similar to being in Wisconsin. We talk about this a lot, but the Métis that were Native and French Canadian that often enlisted as French Canadian, Hispanic soldiers probably could have just enlisted as white soldiers. You would never know. You wouldn't know that I'm a Latino or Latina. So they would have had the exact same experience. So even if they were Hispanic Latinx, it didn't necessarily mean that the other soldiers would know that. So they could have, if they felt that pressure of being not welcomed, they could also kind of hide their identity and change who they were in this capacity. For my research, some of the Spanish either born or Spanish descendants ended up becoming officers in the USCT. So we have Ferrero, who is an officer in the USCT. We have Luis Emilio, who is the son of two Spanish-born parents, that it is part of the 54th Massachusetts and becomes an officer in there. So it also, I have no record of this, but it also might show some capacity for acceptance of other soldiers that maybe don't fit the mold that we think of the Civil War soldier.
And then since he had become, and I think this is with Cavada,
okay.
Since he was a US citizen, shouldn't he have had legal protection from execution in Cuba? And I imagine that would apply to both of the Cavada brothers.
I think they gave it up for the fighting. They felt very passionately to fight the insurrection in Cuba and make sure they were for I mean, he was the commander of Cuban forces. So he really turned his identity into a Cuban when he went back to Cuba.
All right, thank you. That really answers that, I think. There's another question about your research. In your research, have you come across any Sephardic Jewish immigrants from Spanish-speaking countries who fought in the Civil War? Were any of them descendants of conversos from the Inquisition?
No, but now I want to expand my research. I feel like with this, again, it's there's not a ton of work being done in Spanish, in Hispanic, and Latinx soldiers. So every little story and kind of hint you get helps go in a different direction. I know we had a book at our museum that we thought would help us with the project, and it ended up just being names of potential Hispanics that served in the Civil War. So it was a good jumping off point, but it really didn't give us our research. So no, but thank you, I appreciate it.
And Bob says that he lives near Pottsville, Pennsylvania, and that there's a statue there of Colonel Pleasance.
Hey, that's great. I guess I gotta go.
And that his great-grandfather was an Irish immigrant with the 114th Pennsylvania, so some good connections there, and was captured with Cavada on July 2nd, 1863.
Wow, that's amazing. That is so many great tie-ins to my speech, my little talk. We could have given it.
Yeah, that's great. That's fascinating.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing.
And let's see if we've got another question. Somebody says, I found an image of Captain Adrian Vidal painted by Daniel Leon and a photograph of his grave. Not sure, and it moved. Not sure how I can share those two photographs here. And I think the answer is you probably can't. If you want to type maybe the URL, put the URL in the chat feature, then people could look it up later. But we've kind of got the screen share set to very tight parameters, so I can't let you share those, but maybe you can tell people where they can find those images. And I think you mentioned having found a
I think it's the same painting. I'm cautious with copyright, so that's why I didn't share the painting or Cavada's paintings. But it is kind of how I described him: the dark complexion, dark hair, hazel eyes. I think he's in more traditional Mexican clothing, potentially like a Mexican army outfit than a Civil War soldier.
And I think it looks like we've got another question that just came in. Since many units adopted a distinct ethnic identity, like the Irish Brigade or the Garibaldi Guards, do you know any Union Army regiments that were heavily Hispanic and which adopted a distinct Hispanic unit name?
No, I don't know, but I would be researching them very excitedly. The reason that I got interested in this is growing up, again, I loved the Civil War from as long as I could remember, but no one reminded me of me when I was researching it. So I know I wouldn't find that many women. You know, we hear the ones that snuck in, or the nurses, or those that served in other capacities, but there weren't any that shared a lot of those traditional values that come with being a Hispanic. And, you know, so I wanted to see someone that reminded me of my dad, or reminded me of my family and the people, like my uncle, or so. And again, I work with 8th graders, and 8th graders will only like something that's relevant to them. And so for me, I went out and I said, okay, who's like me in the Civil War? I mean, I am not like Vidal, I will say that, but he does come from actually close to where my family is from. So having that personal connection to me is really important. So if I knew that there was a Hispanic regiment that might be out there, or more than just 2 or 3 or a handful in a company, I'd be like wearing that on a t-shirt, I think. So.
Well, I love the way that you were able to, you know, kind of tie it into your heritage, the talk, and then also that it made a connection with one of our viewers. That's incredible.
I love that. Thank you again for sharing that story.
And it looks like Cindy has said that she has done some research on Sephardic Jews in the Civil War and didn't come across any. I assume she's meaning soldiers, because I do know that Judah Benjamin, who was the Confederate Secretary of State for most of the war, was a Sephardic Jew. But there's so many different aspects of the Civil War that people can delve into, which
I know.
I think is why we continue to study it.
Absolutely. It's kind of a little niche audience to talk about Hispanics in the Union Army, but someone's got to, so I'm happy to.
And we'll take one last question. Have you found any pushback from history buffs or other historians on countering the white man's war narrative of the Civil War? And somebody says that they found that same in his USCT study.
Yes, I am I'm young, I'm going to say female in a very male dominated field. Yes. And also my job, I'm very fortunate. I focus on people. So I focus on teaching the Civil War, but I also focus on Indigenous histories at my other museum and Indigenous cultures. So I'm able to tie kind of both of my loves together at my current position. So I bring a lot of that, like the land acknowledgement and a lot of the Indigenous elements to the Civil War, because for me, again, it's so important to talk about everyone that served. So although today I didn't focus that much on, you know, the traditional white man's war, I tell stories of those that are white men that served in the Civil War. I also talk a lot about the USCT. I personally, there's an amazing story about a man that came from the Philippines who served in Michigan, which is one of the 7 states we talk about at our museum. And I love that story. He came the furthest to fight for Michigan. How cool. And so for me, I don't necessarily see it as trying to just bunk the kind of traditional way that we talk about the Civil War, which is the white savior, African-American, just enslaved. I see it completely different, and that everyone was there and everyone has a really important story to tell during this time.
Thank you, Jen. And I think that's a wonderful way to look at it. It's been great having you with us tonight. I feel like I learned some new things. And thank you all for joining us for our History Happy Hour. So I will end the meeting now, but please be sure to join us for future programs.
Thank you so much.